Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story? Danny and Cindy were enjoying their second date together. They had gone to a scary movie, splitting a large popcorn and a soda with 2 straws, and then for a long drive in Danny's car. The warm air coming in through the windows felt like summer waving its final goodbye before fall. They drove out of town and up to the top of a hill known as the Overlook, also known as the local makeout spot. Danny parked the car, turning off the headlights, and Cindy absorbed the view ahead of her. She could see the entire town of Haddington, though it was just a mess of lights from here. Surprisingly, it was almost romantic. Wanting a change in music, Danny turned the radio dial, catching an emergency news bulletin in progress.
Police are still searching for a local fugitive known as the Hook Man, on the loose since escaping yesterday from the Maple Grove Mental Hospital and believed to be heading south. Authorities are still unsure how he managed to leave the facility, and though local activists are encouraging a town curfew, the mayor has not yet announced a plan. We're recommending all you lovebirds out there stay in groups and head home as soon as you can. We'll be back with the full story at 10.
That's
This
so
is
scary.
Brett Barker with CCN.
Danny, close the windows.
Oh, come on.
Danny, please.
Fine, but they're just gonna fog back up.
I think we should go back into town.
Babe, we're safe.
We aren't far from the prison.
The doors are locked. They said he was going south, nowhere near us.
It's too
He had no
close.
reason to come up here. You
I don't
think he
wanna-
wants to take in the view?
He did have a good point.
Come here, let me hold you.
He moved in on her once more, but she firmly declined.
I want to go home now.
Ugh, you girls are always afraid of something.
Wounded, he retreated to his seat. He placed the keys back into the ignition and started the car. In that moment, Cindy heard a faint scraping noise outside her door.
Did you hear that?
Danny turned the car off again, and the silence returned.
Danny, don't stop the car. I want to go.
He's here, Cindy.
Danny!
He held his right hand up, forming the shape of a hook with his fingers and leaning towards Cindy.
It's the Hook Man. He's here to murder all the horny teenagers.
Danny!
She was still frustrated, but laughing a bit helped relieve some of her fear.
Well, I'm glad I'm safe, but it looks like you're screwed.
Yeah, just not the way I hoped. I'm gonna show you there's no one out there, okay? If I do that, can we stay? It's not even 9 o'clock.
I don't care what time it is. I'm not in the mood.
He reached to touch her face, but she shifted away.
Challenge accepted.
Cindy yelped in protest as Danny exited the car, over-dramatically looking around. He called out in an exaggerated macho voice, tempting whoever could be listening to come out of the shadows. She squinted, looking into the darkness. There was only Danny. She crossed her arms, checking the mirrors. He returned to the car, opening the door.
That turn you on?
The opposite, actually. Can we please go?
Whatever.
Without getting into the car, he slammed the door and began walking towards the trees. Cindy called from her window, exasperated.
Where are you going?
I'm taking a piss.
She was furious. Sitting in the dark car alone, she found herself questioning her taste in men and vowed to do better. A few minutes passed, and Cindy began to grow anxious. She glanced through the back window to the evergreen trees, but only saw the dark. She turned back around and sat, picking at her nails. Obviously, Danny was going to try to scare her. She wouldn't bother with his stupid games. She sat straight ahead, stone-faced. But several more minutes passed, and she couldn't help but feel that he was awfully committed to the joke. Even someone as stubborn as Danny would have gotten bored by now. Cindy honked the horn, keeping her eyes on the trees behind her. Nothing. She honked again and again, but still quiet. She tried to force back the frustrated tears welling in her eyes. Was he going to keep her out here all night? Cindy waited there, mentally going through her to-do list to pass the time, and thought about her family. She'd likely be grounded for missing curfew, though that would be a good excuse to avoid Danny for a while. She just hoped they hadn't heard about the lunatic on the loose. As she pondered what she'd say when she got home, it began to rain. A few drops at first, then more and more steady. A storm was expected, but not until the dead of night. She knew Danny would never stay out in the rain by choice, and a deep feeling of dread settled into her stomach when he still didn't return. Looking out her window, she noticed that the glass remained clear, free from droplets or any moisture at all. She looked to the other side, noting the dry window next to the steering wheel. Slowly cracking her window open, she took in the night air. It was dry, almost dusty. It didn't smell like rain. Cindy opened the glove compartment, shifting through papers and trash, but there was nothing of use. She felt underneath her seat and then below the driver's seat, where she touched the body of a long metal flashlight. She pulled it onto her lap, clicking the button, and it spat a bright beam of light into her eyes. Centering herself and breathing deep, Cindy pulled her shoulders through, sitting in the window. She raised the flashlight above, illuminating the trees behind her. There was Danny's gutted body, dangling from the branches that reached over the car. A long, open gash ran from the tip of his chin to his groin, the contents from within spilling out and drooping below. The roof of the car was painted brown with blood and guts. It had never rained at all. Cindy screamed, dropping the flashlight under the car. She pulled herself back inside, shutting the window. And though all the air had left her lungs, the scream continued. Pulling herself together, she squirmed into the driver's seat, feeling for the ignition. She knocked into the headlights, turning them on. Only a few feet in front of the car stood the escaped fugitive in his torn and tattered jumpsuit from the sanitarium. He was a massive, hulking man with long, greasy hair and a sprawling, rotting grin peeking from the shadows overtaking his face. Where his right hand should have been was a long, rusty hook, dripping with blood. Cindy screamed again and furiously groped for the keys. The man stepped towards the car and she stopped, staring at the horrifying figure before her, gleefully dangling the car keys in the headlights. She pressed her hands on the horn as hard as she could, screaming again with all her might. Why couldn't Danny have left the keys? The lunatic bounded towards her, smashing the driver's side window with his hook. Cindy had already jumped into the back seat and opened the door. As she took her first step into the grass, the man grabbed a handful of her hair, forcing her back into the car. She swatted and hit him, but he didn't flinch. His eyes looked hungry, and Cindy was his next meal. His massive, dirty fingers gripped her head with such force that she could feel the hair ripping from her scalp. Her fists landed with less and less force, and she began to accept her fate. Ready for the finale, he pulled her from the back seat by her ankles. She was nearly limp, heavily flopping from the car into the grass with a thud. She couldn't catch her breath. She was feeling faint. The hookman was going to kill her. He fell to his knees, lifting her head from the dirt. They looked at each other, almost agreeing to what would come next, and he raised the hook high above. Then he brought it down, aiming for her throat. But she threw her right hand up mostly by instinct and deflected the blow. For a moment, they were locked there together. The hook had pierced all the way through her hand, latching around her wrist. She screamed in agony, attempting to free herself. He pulled back too, and she felt the muscles in her hand tear away. And then, a glimmer caught her eye from beneath the car. It was the metal casing of the flashlight, only a few inches from her left hand. She clutched the light and swung the metal body against his temple with all her strength. At last, her right hand separated from his hook with one final tear. She now used both hands to smash the lantern directly between his eyes. Cindy squirmed through the grass, crawling like an animal towards the trees before pulling herself to her feet. As she sprinted into the night, a waterfall of red gushed from her arm. Her hand was unrecognizable, and at some point he had gashed her above the shoulder, too. Cindy knew the man was gaining on her as she continued along the tree line, but she was moving as fast as she could. She could only hope that she could reach the bottom of the hill and flag someone on the road. Then, as she came around a cluster of trees, she saw a car several yards away, parked against the steep hillside of the overlook. The windows were foggy, and she heard the muffled sounds of music. Danny and Cindy weren't the only couple on the hill that night. Screaming for help, Cindy made it to the car, beating her good hand against the trunk, then along the windows and finally against the driver's door. Receiving no response, she tried the handle. It was open. She threw herself into the empty seat and shut the door. In that moment, her eyes landed on the two corpses in the rearview mirror. The keys were in the ignition, and she started the engine and locked the doors. She wiped the window with her left hand, trying to clear the condensation, and threw the car into reverse. Cindy backed into the road, trying to ignore the dead couple sitting behind her, and switched to drive. The car was facing the bottom of the hill and the main road. She could lay on the gas and make it to town before the radio switched to the next song. But the lingering monster had appeared in the shadows behind the car, and she couldn't help but feel like she could do something more. Switching back into reverse, she pressed the pedal flat. The car lurched backwards, throwing the bodies behind her onto the floor, and gained speed as she neared the man. He stepped out of the way just in time, and she hit the brakes. He lunged towards the car, smashing the back window with his hook, and reached in for Cindy. She pressed on the gas, but the car hesitated in the mud. The bloody hook grew closer and closer. Finally, the car continued forward, throwing the man to the ground. Cindy twisted the wheel to the side, skidding in a full circle and facing him once again. He lifted himself from the dirt and now stood directly between the car and the steep hill looking into town.
Fuck you.
The car hurtled towards both the man and the drop-off. He lifted his hook into the air and began towards the car, shifting to his right to avoid the vehicle. But that's what Cindy had anticipated, and she yanked the steering wheel left. The front right of the car barreled into the hook man with a loud crunch, launching him over the side of the overlook, down hundreds of feet into the rocky valley below. She wanted to see his body, but she wouldn't stop the car until she made it to safety. As she neared the lights of the town, the tears came, along with the full realization of what had just happened. Cindy pulled into the police station and parked. Crying and shaking, she gingerly touched her wounds. She wanted to faint, or at least sleep until she woke up to find it all a nightmare. But then, she remembered she wasn't alone in the car. Slowly opening the door, Cindy stepped onto the pavement. She was dizzy and shivering, leaving a trail of blood. The rain was moving in now, and the droplets joined the crimson stream running down her arm. She headed towards the station entrance, limping around the back of the car, when her eyes landed on an odd form at the front of the vehicle. Lodged into the metal just above the tire was the man's rusty hook, with the bloody stump still attached at the end. It was a chilly February evening, and all the residents of Church Street had long been snowed in by the storm. The narrow one-street subdivision sat just a few miles away from town, lined by thick pines from each side. Even though the town was near, the street felt quite secluded. It had the aura of a gated community, even though their only gates were evergreen. The neighbors all knew each other, and events and parties frequently spilled beyond the sidewalk and into the street. Everyone looked out for the local kids, and many people left their doors unlocked. It wasn't even 7 o'clock, but it had been pitch black for hours. The snow had been coming down with such a force for so long that the roads into town had disappeared. Plows would be through by the morning, most likely, but the residents of Church Street were snowed in for the night. Evelyn's parents called to let her know that they were staying in a hotel an hour away. They'd been visiting friends, and Evelyn was glad to have the house to herself. She hadn't been home alone there since before she left for college, and the storm gave her the perfect excuse to stay longer and miss class. She bundled up and stepped onto the front porch. A biting gust of wind nearly forced her back inside. Through the endless curtain of pouring snow, she could barely make out the neighbor's house across the street. Shielding her joint from the wind, she clicked the lighter and lit the twisted end. Once she was nice and high, she'd find a snack and pick a movie to watch. Taking in the smoke, she continued looking around. The street had only a few lights, and the illumination didn't stand a chance against the storm. To the left lived Mrs. Keating and her husband. She was lovely, a retired teacher, but he had never said a word to Evelyn even when she lived there. Their living room lights were on. They were probably sleeping in front of the TV. The house next door on the other side belonged to the Washingtons, a group of 5 that perpetually resembled a perfect family portrait. The lights were on throughout their house, so it seemed the whole family was home. Evelyn flicked the butt of her joint into the wind. It was biodegradable, and went back into the house, deadbolting the door. She hung up her coat, removing her dripping hat and boots. As she headed into the living area, walking directly towards the back door, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement on the back deck. She froze, staring at her reflection in the glass. She took a step towards the back door, but immediately changed her mind. She had just smoked. She was stoned. Evelyn went into the kitchen and warmed herself some leftovers, cracking open a can of soda. Flipping through the channels, she found an old Goldie Hawn movie and settled into the couch. After a while, she returned to the kitchen to clear her plate. As she watched her reflection cross the house in the glass of the back door, she was reminded of what had happened before. She left her plate in the sink and calmly walked to the door, nearly pressing her face up to the glass. She looked into the night. The snow was still coming down, beautifully blanketing the trees. Evelyn's eyes followed the flakes, haphazardly blowing through the wind on their way to the ground. The entire deck was nearly invisible in the mounding snow. It took a few moments for Evelyn to realize what she was looking at, but then her heart sank into her chest. Just on the other side of the glass was a pair of footprints in the snow. It appeared someone had walked from around the house onto the deck and up to the glass door. From there, they continued in the other direction. Evelyn slid the door open, and a gust of wind entered the house. Shocked, she slammed it closed again, quickly turning the lock. The door had been unlatched the whole time. She took deep, measured breaths, trying not to panic. If she had come in from smoking just a few moments later, she may have met the surprise visitor face to face. Evelyn called her parents, but they didn't answer. She called a friend, but he didn't answer either. She was desperately trying to feel like she wasn't alone. Finally, she called her neighbor, Mrs. Keating.
Hello?
Mrs. Keating, hi. It's Evelyn from next door.
Evelyn, sweetheart. I thought I saw you walking in the other day. Just visiting?
House sitting, actually. My parents are out of town, but I'm sorry. I'm kind of freaking out right now. I'm here alone, and outside in the snow, there's footprints coming up the back door. I think I saw someone trying to get in, and I don't know if they left or...
Oh, my goodness, dear. You sound so frightened. First, have you made sure all of the doors are locked?
Yes, everything is locked now.
Okay, sweetie. You need to call the police.
Oh, I thought that too, but they won't be able to get here before tomorrow at the earliest.
Mrs. Keating didn't respond. Evelyn's eyes stayed on the back door.
I called my parents, but I guess they're busy. I don't know. I'm just really scared. Mrs. Keating? Mrs. Keating?
Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I thought to double-check my own locks, and there are footprints leading to our back door, too.
Evelyn didn't know what to say.
Isn't that strange? Our doors are locked, of course. I can't believe we didn't notice. We're sitting right here.
Mrs. Keating, I think I have to call the Washingtons. The footprints go towards their house.
Mrs. Keating planned to phone the police at the same time, and they'd follow up with the other once they had more information. It felt like Evelyn's ribcage would bruise from the pressure of her pounding heart, and she was desperate to calm down. She pulled a bottle of whiskey from the pantry to her lips and drank. Mr. Washington picked up the phone on the second ring, and was as surprised as Mrs. Keating to hear from Evelyn. After she explained, he walked to the back of the house. A long silence was followed by him confirming that they, too, had footprints walking up to their back door, which then continued towards the next house. They disconnected so Mr. Washington could reach out to his neighbor. Before Evelyn could decide what to do next, he was already calling back. The Beckers were out of town, he said, and confirmed on their security system that the house was locked up tight. Whoever it was must have continued to the next house. Evelyn was at a loss for what to do. She didn't know the neighbors any further down the road. She turned the TV off, but the silence was blaring. Just after she turned it back on, her phone rang. It was Mrs. Keating.
Evelyn, dear, have you spoken to anyone else yet?
Yes, I spoke to Mr. Washington. The footprints went to his back door, too.
Rod Wilson, a few doors down, confirmed there were footprints there, too, and they keep on going to the next house.
Well, do you know who lives there?
Yes, it's that queer little man and his dogs. I can never remember his name, and I don't have his phone number.
What did the police say?
What do you think? They said they'll be here in the morning.
Do you have anyone else's number on the street?
Yes. Just Betty Whitaker in the last house at the end.
Mrs. Keating kept Evelyn on the line while she made a three-way call. The phone rang a few times, and finally, Betty answered.
Whitaker residence.
Betty, dear, it's Loretta.
Hi, Loretta. How are you holding up?
I've also got little Evelyn on the line with me.
Hello.
Little Evelyn? Little Evelyn Peters?
Hi, Mrs. Whitaker.
Betty, I've got kind of a weird question to ask you. Are you near your back door?
No, I'm upstairs in the den. Why do you ask?
We don't want to alarm you, but we think someone's going around trying to break into houses. Everyone on the street had these footprints walking up to their back doors.
You keep your doors locked, right?
Let me just find my slippers. Here. I'm going downstairs now to check. Nobody ever comes all the way to the end of the street. Not even my own grandchildren. So I don't think...
Mrs. Whitaker?
Betty, do you see footprints?
Yes. I'm looking at my back porch now. There are footprints leading up to the door, but none leading away.
What came next was a blur. Word spread quickly over the phone, and a group of 3 husbands, Mr. Washington included, took off for the Whitaker house together to ensure that Betty was all right. The men looked everywhere but didn't find anyone inside. They couldn't find any indication that someone had entered from the backyard One of them joked that Betty was the source of the footprints the whole time, that she had forgotten where she lived and wandered to every house before she finally got home. Though a tad cruel, it did account for the fact that the footprints never left. Betty agreed to stay with the Washingtons until the morning, until the police could confirm that her home was safe. She didn't want to be there alone. In the mid-afternoon the next day, the roads were finally cleared enough for emergency vehicles to get through. Betty met the officers outside her house, watching an entire team go in and out, checking every room thoroughly. They couldn't find a sign that anyone had been there other than Mrs. Whittaker herself, and the footprints out back were long lost to the storm. The house, they said, was secure. Both Mrs. Keating and Evelyn received calls from Mrs. Whittaker to share the news and invite them over for cocoa. The neighbors bundled up and walked to the end of the street together, laughing about how scared they had been. Now that the footprints were gone, even Evelyn started to question if they were ever there at all. Mrs. Whittaker had just gone into the kitchen to fetch the schnapps when both Evelyn and Mrs. Keating heard a dull sound from below. They went silent, holding for another noise. They heard Betty tuddling around the kitchen, but nothing else. After an hour or so, the guests put on their coats and headed home. They were only passing the next driveway when they heard a horrible, petrified scream from the house they'd just left. Evelyn sprinted back to the Whittaker house, leaving Mrs. Keating behind. As she neared the driveway, a thin man burst through the front door, running into the yard and towards the street. He wore all black and his eyes were dark and wide. He rushed so frantically that he fell to all fours for a few strides before getting back up to his feet. Evelyn screamed. Mrs. Keating saw him too and began yelling to alert the other neighbors as the man made his way down Church Street. Evelyn threw herself through the front door, calling for Mrs. Whittaker. There was no response. She called again, stepping slowly towards the dining room she'd left just minutes ago. The smell of cocoa still lingered. As Evelyn passed through the frame into the room, she found the poor old woman lying lifeless on the floor. The basement door was wide open, and Evelyn's eyes followed the stairs down into the darkness. Below, she saw several boxes and suitcases, one of which was lying open and empty. Just looking at it, it should not have been large enough to contain an adult man. Mrs. Keating finally made it to the front door. She hollered something about the intruder, but Evelyn didn't comprehend it.
Stay in there, Mrs. Keating.
Evelyn didn't want her to have to see her old friend lying there, an innocent casualty in the stranger's search for shelter. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Poor Mrs. Whittaker likely died of fright. First thing in the morning, every morning, Grace went to see her son. She'd plant a kiss and hold his chin and remind him how much she loved him. Sometimes she'd sing to him or tell him a story. "Mommy's here," she would say, even though he couldn't hear her. She had moved with Paul across the country into a tiny apartment she didn't like. They'd only dated a few weeks, but he tore her away from everyone she knew. For a number of reasons, most of the people she'd loved throughout her life had disappeared. Only a few months after they'd settled into the new place, Paul disappeared too. And Grace was alone, to grieve a relationship that never was. She worked long hours to barely cover the rent and ached for connection. Calls back home went unreturned, and the dark blanket of loneliness grew heavier with each day spent on her own. She couldn't blame them for ignoring her. After all, she'd disappeared. Several weeks after Paul had gone, the apartment began to rock back and forth like a great ship riding the waves of the storm. Grace stumbled to the toilet just in time, retching into the bowl and finally calming the waters. Never in her life had she dealt with nausea like this, and she began to suspect what she assumed would be impossible. Yet the test confirmed it. She was pregnant. By some wild chance, Paul had left something behind after all. So Grace did everything to prepare both herself and her home for the impending arrival. She'd give this child the life she'd never had and fill their days with love. He arrived that winter right on schedule, and the birth was quick and easy. Grace and Christopher spent their first 2 years learning and growing and loving together. She did everything to show that he could trust her and love her, and she would never disappear. But that's a promise he couldn't make in return. A short bout of illness escalated rapidly, and the poor boy lost his life without ever setting foot in the hospital. Grace begged him to open his eyes, or to smile, anything. The boy was gone, but she wasn't ready to let him go. Grace tucked him into bed, kissing his cold forehead, and hurried to the library. She immersed herself in ancient rituals and texts, visiting occult shops across the city and reading handwritten notes and translations. She studied black magic and witchcraft. Along the way, those she spoke with warned of the possible dangers ahead, but Grace wouldn't listen. With only a few days of his passing, she'd located one of the last remaining copies of a long-forgotten book of dark magic and worked through every page. Some were illegible, while others were scribbled with updates and additional notes. Finally, she found a conjuring spell that seemed to offer what she desired. Grace could never explain how she did it, but somehow it worked. She guided Christopher's faint, lost soul back to his body. His eyes opened, and he smiled. The mother and son embraced and danced and laughed and ran and played. Grace was overwhelmed and nearly giddy. Could she simply pretend it never happened? And could the rules of the underworld really be so plain? The boy didn't seem to remember anything, and she preferred it that way. She wanted him to live the carefree life a child deserves, without the weight of the world on his shoulders. Each night, they fell asleep cuddled together in bed as Grace read aloud from his favorite book. She was so happy, so content. Here in her home was an angel on earth. But on their 4th day together, Grace stepped from the bedroom to begin the coffee and returned to wake her son. She found the room stale, nearly rancid. Plugging her nose, she rushed to the window, inhaling the fresh air from outside. The noise caused Christopher to wake, and he sat up with a loud smile. Without even trying, Grace displayed one to match. They'd start their day with a walk in the park. Hand in hand, they wandered in the winter sun. Each time they came upon a group of children, Grace would introduce her son and ask if they wanted to play. But every time, the kids politely declined with wide eyes. As they continued their stroll, they came upon a bench. Grace lifted Christopher to sit next to her and looked at him in the sunlight. His face was pale,
almost completely without color and beginning to sink. His nose was running heavily. She removed his scarf, wiping the dribble away, but the skin of his upper lip began to pull away too. Christopher winced in pain, but held still. She looked around. Why was everyone staring? They'd better get home for lunch. He sat like such a good boy while she made a large pot of noodles, but didn't have an appetite when it came time to eat. As she drew him a bath, he began to vomit, heaving red and brown and green and black into the toilet bowl. Grace covered her mouth. She didn't want to scream. Finally, he stopped and fell to the floor with exhaustion. She picked him up, hushing his cries, and put him in the bath, returning with a cloth to wash his face. She dipped it into the warm water and began to wipe away the vomit. She had barely made contact with his cheek when a large chunk of skin slipped off and plopped into the water, instantly turning the entire bath red. Now she couldn't help but scream. She slammed the bathroom door behind her as her child gurgled and wailed. With a trembling voice, she called back inside to her son, promising that she'd be right back. She hurried to her room and took a box from under her bed, placing the giant rotting book from inside it onto her covers. She flipped to the page she had bookmarked and read everything to herself again and again. Finally, she realized what she had misunderstood. Grace had never brought her son back to life. She had simply brought his soul back to his body. She returned to the bathroom and wrapped what was left of her child in a towel, carrying him back to his room. And she continued loving him and comforting him as his body swelled and leaked and decayed, taking with him everything but the bones. She only hoped he didn't feel it much. Grace pored over the book again and studied several others. She returned to the shops and the library and experts, but nobody had any answers. Before, she was willing to do anything for her son to be alive. Now, she'd do anything to let him rest. Weeping into the skies, she begged the powers above to collect his soul. But it was too late. Grace had cheated death, and her punishment was to keep what she stole. Weeks later, she gathered his bones and placed them into his old bassinet in the corner of her room. She tucked them into the blanket along with the toy and made sure he was most comfortable. Sometimes at night she could hear the bones knocking against each other, and she knew that he hadn't disappeared. First thing in the morning, every morning, Grace went to see her son. She'd plant a kiss and hold his chin and remind him how much she loved him. "Mommy's here," she would say, even though he couldn't hear her, for he was only bones.
Mommy's Here, told by Shannon Leigh Webber.
It started as a normal day. It was chilly, and Haddington's only department store was gearing up for the Black Friday rush to begin at 6 a.m. sharp. The store's customers were known to pound on the doors before opening even on a regular day, so the staff knew to be prepared for the worst. Or so they thought. First in line was an older woman, Margot, steaming cup of tea in hand. Everyone at the store knew Margot. She always had something to complain about, some expired coupon to demand using. She remarked to those near her in the line that she expects the store to let everyone wait inside until the sales start if they valued them as customers. Nobody responded. Further back in the line was a father and his son, Toby. Toby's dad was headed to the electronics to find a flat-screen TV, but Toby would be headed to the toys to get that remote control car he'd seen all the commercials for. Behind them was Tina, a single woman in her early 30s. She planned to hit every department she could, and she had her list ready. As the sun rose, the crowd grew more and more impatient. A few minutes before the doors opened, the speakers kicked on and a cheerful Christmas tune echoed through the parking lot. The energy shifted as the customers watched the employees make their final preparations through the windows. And then, the doors separated. The sign lit up. The store was now open. Margot used her bony elbows to make sure nobody beat her to the discounted purses she had her eyes on. She grabbed several, leaving very few for anyone else, and began to head back to the registers. Toby hadn't seen his father since the first few seconds in the store, and he couldn't see anything in the massive stampede of adults. Though he was overwhelmed, he kept his mind on that car. Tina had planned to go to electronics first, but as she entered the anarchy of the store, she made the swift decision that her father's gift would come first. The newest, biggest capacity, shiniest blender you can get. She squeezed her way through the crowd towards the appliances. These were the final moments that resembled anything like a typical Black Friday. Margot made it to the register first and plopped the bags down without saying a word. After the final bag was scanned, she took out her credit card to pay. Was it a gust of wind? Or maybe it was her frail, wrinkly hands. Something happened, and she dropped the card. As she bent over to grab it from the floor, her gaudy necklace triggered the conveyor belt to move forward. Her entire body lurched towards the cashier, who screamed and grabbed at the jewelry to no avail. Margot desperately grabbed at her throat to remove the necklace, but it was too tight. She was flailing, choking, desperate to breathe. Her face turned from white to red to purple, and she flailed less and less. The conveyor belt kept pulling and pulling. The gears chewed past the necklace and began feasting on her wrinkly skin. In a matter of seconds, her entire face was pulled off like a sticky Halloween mask, squishing into the gears and spraying blood in every direction. Finally, the belt caught the gray hair she had pulled into a bun and removed it at once, disappearing into the machine like it hadn't eaten in days. For a moment, the rest of her lingered there, half collapsed by the register. From the shoulders up, she was nothing but bloody bone, other than her eyes, which made piercing contact with those screaming around her. But the rest of the store was distracted.
because it wasn't just the conveyor belt that suddenly became deadly. It was everything. The motorized scooters near the entrance had started driving around aimlessly, mowing down whatever and whoever was in their paths. Back in the appliances, nearly everything had turned on at once. Hands and faces were filleted away by blenders and electric knives. Shelves collapsed, littering the floor with butcher knives and cheese graters, ready to destroy whatever flesh found its way to them. Everywhere, bloody bodies tripped and tangled with each other. Tina could see all this happening from the frozen food aisle. She hadn't made it to appliances yet when it all started happening, and now she stood in the middle of the freezer section. She was desperate to find a way to escape a store where everything had seemingly come to life with the desire to kill. Toby was in the toys with a few other kids when it all started happening. Heavy boxes were lurching from the shelves, the toys loudly honking and singing and reciting whatever program lines they had. Shortly before this all happened, Toby had made eye contact with a cute young girl on the other side of the aisle, near the dolls. Now he watched as she was swiftly crushed by the child's playset that had suddenly come crashing down from the display over the aisle. Toby had to get to his dad. He turned around to find a way out of the aisle when he stopped in his tracks. 10 feet away was a fleet of remote control cars, although no one was controlling them, of course. Normally, they looked fun and exciting. Now they were menacing. Toby wasn't a big kid, and with so many of them, he didn't stand a chance. As they sped towards him, he turned and ran as fast as he could, quickly hitting the dead end that was created by the falling playset. He tried to find a way to climb it, but he couldn't find anything to hold. At the very last second, Toby jumped onto the shelf, holding onto the metal prongs that normally displayed trading cards. The cars slammed into the playset with exploding bits of metal and plastic flying in every direction. That was close. Toby climbed to the top of the shelf and observed the crowd. He immediately knew he was never finding his father. Tina had finally left the freezer section, but now found herself near the produce. It seemed like the best route to the front doors. She didn't notice that the automatic sprayers above the fruit had gone into hyperdrive, soaking everything around them. Crying, she climbed past overturned carts and the bodies of those run down by the scooters. She didn't see the puddle ahead of her, and her foot slipped the second it attempted touchdown. She landed hard on her back, immediately soaked. A few feet away, the water found its way to the tongue of an extension cord. Tina was killed instantly, along with the dozens of others who were attempting to cross the water or touching anything metal nearby. Toby stood at the front of the aisleway, seeing people trampling over each other, breaking bones and cracking skulls against the floor. The entire grocery section was sparking and crackling, and dozens of bodies trembled in a disturbing electric dance. The sparks were starting to reach the dry goods. Toby knew it was a matter of moments before there would be a fire. His dad would expect him to get out. It would be impossible to try to find him now. Toby surveyed the bloodshed once more, trying to predict the best route of exit. Only then did he notice the people strung up to the ceiling like ornaments tangled in the Christmas lights with blue and purple faces. Were the objects moving? If he didn't go now, he'd never make it. He'd have to use his small size to his advantage. He reached over and untangled a string of lights from the display of bodies and wrapped the cord up in his hands. He jumped from the aisle top, swinging above the panicked customers desperately trying to escape. He let go at the last possible second and hit the tile only a few feet from the registers. On his left, he could see straight into the garden center, though he wished he had never looked. The mowers and saws were having a holiday of their own. The walls were painted deep red, and mangled limbs and dismembered bodies decorated the ground. Toby stayed low, crawling under the registers. He wanted to do nothing more than to stand up and sprint, but he had no idea what was waiting for him past the checkout area. It was getting really warm and harder to breathe. The fire was starting to consume the back half of the store. Toby cleared the registers and stood fully up for the first time. The sliding glass doors were right there, opening and closing quickly like the jaws of a giant metal monster. He picked up a long piece of metal shelf from the floor and started running. Whatever came flying at him, he batted it away with his makeshift shield. Without ever meaning to, he was screaming as loud as he could. As he made it to the entrance, he threw the shelf into the angry doors, causing a temporary jam. He turned and yelled for others to follow, that the doors were open. But there was no one even close. He ran through the doors and kept going until he got to the very last parking space and collapsed, coughing and crying in the freezing cold morning air. He looked around the parking lot. Other than the violent noises leaking from the store, the outside felt rather normal. A gentle snow fell from the sky, and Toby knew that his father was already dead. There were only a few survivors. They all told the same story, but it didn't matter. Authorities called it a group hallucination caused by smoke inhalation. The store had simply caught on fire, they said, and most of the customers died in a panic trying to get out. But the survivors knew better, and Haddington outlawed Black Friday after that. The official word was that it was out of respect for the hundreds who died, but those who knew the truth understood it was a way of making sure it never happened again. But of course, they couldn't be sure of that. Toby turned and left the parking lot, walking along the barren sidewalk towards home. Police cars passed him on their way to the store. He could hear the fire trucks in the distance. As he rounded the corner into his cul-de-sac, it was nearly silent. The fluffy snow acted as a sponge to the sound, and Toby could only hear the crunching below his sneakers. What was he going to tell his mom? But then, he started hearing something else. A familiar, high-pitched electric hum. Breathing deep, he turned around. Just behind him was a remote control car, ready to hit the gas.
Black Friday, written by Bryan Renaud, told by Shannon Leigh Webber.